Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and to help you engage with the Texas legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and you loved us sharing the Religious Leaders panel so much last week, we thought we'd do it again today. As you'll remember from last week, Texas Impact just concluded a 3-event kickoff series for our Houston Faith Votes campaign in partnership with local congregations and organizations in Houston. They were held August 20th at Congregation Beth Israel, August 26th at Brentwood Baptist Church, and August 27th at Servants of Christ United Methodist Church. The materials from these conversations isn't Houston specific, but hopefully inspires all of us to engage our congregations in civic engagement work, and specifically to mobilize our congregations and communities to participate in every election. Texas Impact has tools for you to do that. Check out texasimpact.org or find the materials from the Houston Faith Votes campaign at houstonfaithvotes.org. Now is the perfect time to be planning that work, and I hope this panel encourages you to take that step. So, with no further ado, this week's conversation is from the August 26th Faith Leaders panel at Brentwood Baptist Church and features Reverend Dr. Joe Samuel Ratliff, Senior Pastor at Brentwood Baptist Church, Bishop Michael Rinehart, Bishop of the Gulf Coast Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Reverend Mike Stone, Dean of the Galveston Convocation and Rector of St. Thomas the Apostle Episcopal Church, and Judge Manpreet Singh, Judge in the Harris County Civic Court No. 4 and a leader in the Sihk community. So here we go. I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation.
Thank you all for being here and for participating in the panel. And some of you I've known before, and some of you I just met today, so thank you very much. I just wanted to take a minute to tell you a little bit about a conversation actually Manpreet and I had earlier this week. And Manpreet asked me a question. She said, Kim, I was really surprised that I was the only non-Christian on the panel. And as you heard, Manpreet, you're with the Sihk tradition. And I explained, I said, Texas Impact is an interfaith organization, but historically, the Christian tradition, mainline Protestant, especially the Baptist tradition, have had so much history in engagement. And we're all here today to learn lessons, to take back to our own congregations, to know how do you do this. So we're learning from the people who historically have been doing this, but we want all traditions to do that. And Manpreet is here because as the first elected judge in Texas from the Sihk tradition, she single-handedly did a lot of campaigning in her own tradition. And when she told me those stories, I thought, Manpreet has a lot to share with us on what it's like to try to campaign in a non-Christian tradition. So the value that all 4 of these representatives have is here. But I thought if Manpreet was thinking that, anyone else out there is thinking that too, especially if you're from a non-Christian tradition. So just know that we're all here to learn and to glean the best practices to take them back to our own faith communities. So thank you for that conversation, Manpreet. Thanks. So we're going to start with just kind of a 2 to 3 minute opener. And feel free to jump in at any point. We don't necessarily have to go in any particular order. And the first question is, what from your faith tradition do you point to when talking about the importance of participating in democracy, and specifically about voting? Who'd like to start?
Should I go as the non-Christian?
Sure.
First of all, thank you so much for having us in your home. And thank you to Dr. Allen. She was one of the people who endorsed me in my race and took a leap of faith. And so I appreciate you, your leadership, and of course, the love that you showed me too. So I will say this, a lot of people don't know about the Sihk tradition. We're the 5th largest religion in the world. And it's very democratic based. So we believe in equality, we believe in gender equality and socioeconomic equality. That's where it was born from. I mean, so much so that we don't take on our husband's last name or our father's last name. We have our own last name to distinguish ourselves. So it's a very, very democratic way in which we even practice our religion in terms of how we live our everyday life. We take a democratic vote of all the Sikhs across the world, as hard as it may be. So with that, you would think within our own faith tradition, we would have this huge root into voting and wanting to vote and being super engaged. And what I realized through my election is that really we are battling with our immigration minds, right? Like I'm a first generation immigrant. So my parents' generation and my generation clash in our thinking of how that looks. The countries that most immigrants come from are corrupt, or they don't have a voice, or if they have a voice, it's fake, like India, right? Largest democracy, but it's not. So they don't understand the actual care and what your vote means. And so we have a two-step process in convincing them that here, you can actually walk to your legislature's office and say, hi, I have a problem, and try to do something about it. Versus there where they're just members of a big community just trying to make it. So that's kind of our battle. And so what I was also telling Kim in that same conversation was what I valued about being here is, we're going to learn a lot from the communities. And I learned a lot by being on the campaign trail. I was always in awe, like, oh my God, this community is doing so much for their own community that I could take it back to mine. But what I also think that another purpose for me to be on here is to say, you guys are doing great, go further, because we're still struggling. And so I want you guys to recognize how great work has already been done and how much more can be done so much more easily within your communities than it is in ours. So that's what I have to say.
For that perspective.
Well, the Black church has historically been the forefront of leadership in voting. The fraternity that helped sponsor this today, even our theme in the 40s was a voteless people is a hopeless people. And we began to witness through history how the civil rights movement, all of the civil rights laws that were passed, and then to be able to encourage and engage our people to vote. That has been a challenge in this last generation or two, but at the same time, we have in our congregations fostered voter registration drives, voter education drives. When you join our church, we in that packet is a voter registration card, and making sure that they at least make that move there. And then to be able to engage our people, to encourage them, because as State Rep said, politics is local. And we have to be able to make it how important that is. And the challenge that we've had and yet trying to engage our folk, to push them forward, to be able to make these things matter. And not at just the national level, but these local and state issues are before us, and we have to be able to do that. And so we've done it. We've challenged it. It's an annual. We don't just wait till the season to talk about voter education, voter registration, that sort of thing, but to be able to keep it in front of the people is our effort.
Bishop and Dean, that connection between theology and voting.
Sure, my tradition. So I'm a Lutheran, and as a Lutheran Christian, I go back to Jesus' statement, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. So this recognition that there are these two realms in which we operate, this earthly realm and a spiritual realm at the same time, and they overlap, but to recognize and distinguish between the two. And of course, Paul in Romans 13, go back to where Paul says, be subject to the governing authorities, pay your taxes, be a good citizen, so on and so forth. And then St. Augustine then carried out that tradition as well too, where he wrote about the city of God and he wrote about the earthly city too, and that we have responsibilities to both of these realms. So that's where my tradition comes from. Luther picked up on this as well, in that Luther talked about two kingdoms. You had the kingdom on the left, which is this earthly kingdom, which is a blessing, a gift from God, and you have the kingdom on the right, which is a spiritual realm as well too. But he believed that Christians can and should participate in this kingdom on the left, and that government leaders needed to recognize that there's a kingdom on the right as well, too. Luther saw government as a gift from God, as a jewel. Now, Luther believed that preaching was the most important thing for the spiritual realm. No question about that at all. He said, government, the secular authorities, make that preaching possible by creating good order in the world. And that not everyone is Christian, and therefore we need to have a broad-minded government entity that takes care of those who are in need, that establishes public schools. He was a big fan of public schools. And make sure that the roads are taken care of, make sure that there is justice for the widow, the orphan, and the alien. Luther couldn't vote, so it's hard to get him to talk about voting. There was voting in the medieval period, but there were electors. You had to be part of a special class to be able to vote. But if Luther could vote, he would absolutely say it is not only our right, but it is our responsibility to expect good government.
So I get to talk about two traditions because I was ordained in the Southern Baptist Church originally. And the importance of voting is on record that in the mid-'80s, a few gentlemen, a small minority, intentionally took over the convention because they relied on people not voting. And so one of the largest conventions in the world was taken over by a splinter group. And when I was in seminary, I had professors being recorded, and they could lose their jobs and their intellectual freedom because this group took voting so much more seriously than the larger group that they were able to affect injustice. I'm just going to say that. So now I belong to the Episcopal tradition, and I'm pretty grateful to say that the largest democratic meeting in the world happens at the Episcopal General Convention every 3 years. That'll be next year in Louisville. So there'll be more than 1,200 delegates there to vote, and this is part of our tradition. And the early framers of the Constitution set the church up to be like this, just like they set the nation up to be like this. And we see it go both ways. So I was able to interview astronaut Bobby Satcher this week, the first surgeon to go into outer space. And Bobby Satcher grew up Southern Baptist in South Carolina. And curiously enough, his parents became Episcopalian in the 60s because the Episcopal Church in that state stood up for civil rights. And his home church did not. So that's why they became Episcopalian. A lot of pride there. Of course, we got it wrong in a lot of places too, just to be honest. What's important for us today, we're celebrating 40 years of women being ordained to the priesthood, and we've had now almost 36 years of women being bishops in the Episcopal Church. The way that happened is by voting at General Convention, which we do every 3 years. 40 years ago, a bishop ordained 11 women without permission. This happened, and the General Convention had to figure out what to do with it. So this happened. I was sitting at the one 20 years ago when we decided that openly gay clergy could not only be, could be clergy, but could also be bishops. Gene Robinson had been ordained without permission. And we voted it in. And so what we do in our tradition is delegates get up and they get 3 minutes and they can say whatever they want and then the microphone turns off. There's no filibuster. You get 3 minutes, you make your point, you sit down, and the way we've changed so that we've said not only women are equally fit and right in the eyes of God to be bishops, clergy, is through voting. And the same with same-sex rights as well has happened through voting in the Episcopal tradition.
Thank you so much. I learned so much just from the four of you, so thank you. Our next area is about collective responsibility. So tell us, who do we leave vulnerable when we don't vote? Start.
I'm going to jump in because I'll be self-immolating here that the Lutheran tradition after the Holocaust had to take a searing internal look at itself and say, because we had developed into a kind of a quietistic religious community that you just, you stay out of politics, you duck your head under, you don't worry about that kind of stuff. And part of that, especially in North America, because when Germans and Scandinavians immigrated to the United States, they were persecuted pretty strongly. And so you keep your head down, you speak English, you behave yourself. And so we developed this kind of quietistic tradition that didn't ultimately serve us well in the long run. And if anybody has read Luther, he was anything but quiet. I mean, hardly an unpublished thought. Luther reorganized the city council in Wittenberg to create a community chest to care for the poor, to pay attention to foreigners in the city and make sure that they were cared for so that the whole city could thrive ultimately. And so our denomination has, in the last 50 to 60 years, really focused again on becoming engaged, and that it is a responsibility of every citizen to be engaged in one way or another.
I think the simple answer is we vote. We leave vulnerable people who can't vote for a variety of reasons, and obviously that's children, right, on whose behalf we're supposed to vote. But that also includes people who are in the hospital, long-term illnesses. Of course, that includes people who are felons. People who are homeless, people who are here on green cards, who don't have the right. Those are easy categories to think about, but I want to talk about felons briefly because not everybody knows that while felons can't vote, they do count proportionally in an area. So prisons get greater proportion of decision-making, even though none of the people in the prisons vote. So those are some of the things that we are set up legally. I mean, that's a created vulnerability that is our responsibility.
So I would say, historically speaking, Sikhs usually stand up for people who don't have a voice. So we take it very seriously. And there was a time when the Hindus were actually being oppressed, and we stood up for them and on their behalf. And so that's basically the way that in which we think and in which we operate. So it's not necessarily for the benefit of us, it's always for the benefit of somebody else when there's an injustice that is made. And I think obviously we all know this, right? We're really preaching to the choir. You like my church analogy? Yes. So, I mean, this is literally where we all understand this, and we all understand that our vulnerable communications aren't necessarily that we're speaking up for people who are not able to speak, but the people who need to speak but need a louder voice. So being allies and double downing on the other voices that may not have the majority.
Yeah, but of course, I've heard of all these Southern Baptist defections here, but and we're not Southern Baptists anymore. And that's because of the vote, because of several hero issues, all the different things that affect our people directly. The young, the old, be able to be a voice for the voiceless. And I think that's been our history, to continue to always fight for the injustices wherever you see them. And they are many. And the mean-spiritedness of this nation right now becomes a real challenge for us on how to do that, even collectively or collaboratively, because of that attitude that permeates our country.
Thank you. You all four made such great points. The next two questions, our last two questions, have to do with our connection to our community and other communities. First question is, what would it look like if congregations effectively engaged in democracy and elections? And what do you imagine they would do? And what do you imagine would be the outcomes? So if congregations really got engaged in democracy and elections, what difference would it make?
So I learned this during my campaign and the numbers that I ran and all that. So again, I kind of mentioned it earlier that we have, women have the same last name, or we have last names that are different from men. So in our faith tradition, all women's last names are Kaur and all last names for men are Singh, and it's a twofold issue. One, in India, you can always tell from somebody's last name where they are in the caste system. So that eliminated that, right? You can't tell by saying Singh or Kaur. And secondly, women had their own last name and men had their own last name. So you look at me and you say, why do you have Singh? The American government made me do it. So my dad was here, and when my mom came as Hardeep Kaur, they said, nope, you can only have one family name, and switched her last name to Singh. So when I was born in the 70s, I too became Kaur Singh. So that's, usually you'll see women who flex into Singh because of that phenomena here in America. So I say all this to say that when I was running, I was able to look in the voter database and literally put Kaur or Singh in the database and pull up all the Sikhs in Houston. So for me, it was an easy ask to say, not only was I going to be the first Sihk in Texas, I was going to be the first female elected Sihk judge in the nation. You need to vote for me. Out of the 5,000 people in Houston that are Sikhs, guess how many voted for me? Maybe 500. And I was able to track it. So, and what I also know too is people lie, right? They say, yeah, we're voting, or we voted, or I voted for you. And I look it up and they're in the Republican primary and I was in the Democratic primary. That's a story for another day. But the point is even when you try to engage your community, apathy is so in-depth and so real. So when the celebrations came along, of course, they were wanting to be a part of it and they wanted to rejoice. And it is my community's win. It's not my win. I want them to have it. I want them to know what it looks and feels like to be a part of a bigger government issue. But the one thing that I will say, and I said this at the last seminar that we had too, the app that I felt like that changed the way in which, and I've worked on campaigns forever. Dr. Allen, I worked on a lot of campaigns before I got here, and be careful when you do because they'll make you run at some point. That's what happened to me. But one of the most effective tools that we have as individual citizens, and I think we should really push this in our church, is called the Reach app, REACH, the Reach app. It goes into your phone, it picks up your contacts, and it tells you if that person has voted or not. And so it doesn't tell you how they voted, unless it's the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, but it tells you that they placed their vote. And so what I was doing systematically, my whole family, everybody I knew would do, we'd systematically go and say, oh, look, Jennifer didn't vote. I would send a text to Jennifer and I'd say, Jennifer, you haven't voted yet. Oh, yeah, I did. No, it's not showing up. So I don't think you have yet. You need to vote. And I also got all my voter stickers because they knew I would find out if they voted or not. So the Reach app, to me, is the best way that we can influence our neighbors. The one lesson that I found out is that people do not do what they say they do unless they know that you can catch them on it. Guilt and shame not only work in church, but it works with friends.
I think when you introduced the word democracy in your question, bothered me in the sense that we basically were taught that this American democracy is a melting pot. And that's not true. It's more like a salad bowl. Right. And I think because of that, we learn to respect the tomatoes, the carrot, we respect each other. And at the same time, begin to find out from each other how we can work together and collaborate and get all of our people out to vote, especially around certain issues.
I think I have a cautionary tale because the churches I grew up in did exactly tell us who to vote for based on two issues. And they were dramatically effective. They endorsed candidates, which is not legal, right? But they said, to heck with the law, this is what we're doing because it's right based on two issues. And it's just important to hear that happens, and that's really effective. The problem is, per the last question, it doesn't take care of the vulnerable. So I think the truth is it's very easy to say, well, we don't know what to do. Other people know what to do. Now, I don't believe in the same tactic, keep in mind, right? I don't think that's right, and I don't think it's fair, but that's happening. So the impetus is on people to say, how do we influence to do this in a considerate way instead of focusing on two issues? What else are we not doing? So for me, I belong to a pretty small church. There's about maybe 250 of us on a Sunday, on a good one, right? But within the city of Houston, there's about 100,000 of us. And so the difference, right, between one church and an association or between a diocese is the ability to say there's 100,000 Episcopalians to our state representative or to our congressperson, and we'd like to have words with you. One person, it's harder, right? One person, it's harder. 100,000, that's a major voter bloc constituency. There's other links that we have that are different. I'm in Clear Lake. We're a bedroom community. You're going to hear from one of my colleagues tomorrow who's in the 3rd Ward, who's actively experienced voter suppression in his area. His church used to be a polling place traditionally for Black residents and having had that polling place shut down, the next closest place was several miles away, which is voter suppression. right? So that's not happening to me, that's happening to my colleague. And what does it take? It takes me talking to my colleagues, right? And then it takes me being able to say, look, we're Episcopalian, so my issue directly may not be yours, but because we're in this together, how do we get to be in it together? Because people in Clear Lake don't know about this happening in the Third Ward. So this is like part of our responsibility is how do we band together? Whether you're Sikh or Jewish or Muslim or various denominations, you've probably got brothers and sisters in the city. And talking to them is pretty democratic. So that's, I would say, as part of it is how do we kind of band together. And the last thing I would say for where we live, we're in a township of about 2,000 homes, and thanks Representative Allen for talking about how important it is to do this at the local level and not just get fixated at the national level. And in a town of 2,000 homes, 250 people is a large constituency, right? And people will go and show up at your church or at a forum that you put. Particularly, there's 4 churches in my small neighborhood, and collaborating with them is a great opportunity to have candidate forums in which you also do voter registration at the same time.
Wow, such thoughtful responses. What was the question?
What would it look like if your congregation effectively engaged in democracy and elections, and what difference would it make?
Thanks, it helps me keep from wandering. So I wish we had the tradition that the historic Black churches have. I really do, and I think we have a lot to learn from y'all. I have seen churches that have served as polling centers, of course, and I think that's a big plus. I like the idea of putting a voter registration card in everybody's bulletin on Sunday morning. I think that would probably stir some things up a little bit, but absolutely, that encourages involvement. I think also talking about the issues themselves. I mean, churches are afraid of being too political, but what they really mean is too partisan. So how do we then just jump over the partisan question altogether, because there is no one party that aligns with the kingdom of God or one denomination for that matter in the Christian church, right? So how do we jump over that and go right to the issues themselves and point out the hurting and the need in our communities and ask the big questions of how are we addressing those things, especially from the Judeo-Christian tradition and the tradition that I'm from, always talks about the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. So how are we paying attention to these vulnerable and other vulnerable groups, and to lift that up and then, talk about what kind of public policy is going to get us to a place where we achieve the highest common good?
I'm going to add to this conversation just with a suggestion. All of you who are members of faith communities probably know who in your congregation have children who have now gone off to college. You need to have a little gathering, a party, and send all of them absentee voter forms, because it is difficult to do that. I went through my cell phone and made sure that I sent and called and texted every single friend I had that I knew had kids who had just gone off to school, and made sure that I sent their child a voter absentee registration. Do that in your congregations, because it is difficult and they make it harder every year. I'll add that. Okay, last question. What key connections and relationships can Houstonians of faith activate in their communities to get out the vote? So what connections and relationships do you have that can help get out the vote?
For me, just like you mentioned, Bishop, it was, the church services that I would go to in the historically Black churches would be at 9. You guys start on time and end on time. So it's like 9 or 10 in the morning, and ours is kind of 11:30-ish to 1-ish. And, it's also our community center, because we don't have those other areas in which we get to see each other. So I would really garner a lot of inspiration from my visits to see exactly how the methodology and how it happened and what happened, and to be able to take it back to my community. So I really think you opening your doors to us really is what we need within the community, in the greater community, seeing what is working, what is happening, how are these communities successful for us to also become successful. So interfaith dialogue, which I know Interfaith Ministries has been promoting for over 20 years, at least with my community, 25 years, is exactly how I think that we can move forward together.
You can also share, we literally in our communities have carpools and drives, picking up people, those who aren't able to go. I think that we could also share that transportation.
Souls to the polls.
Yes,
I also learned that, and I did that.
Yeah. And so we actually have encouraged that and participate with other churches, collaborate on that. So I think you're right.
What was the question? Just kidding. I like the idea of inviting civic leaders in for conversation. I think you got to be careful about that you're getting a wide range of people if you're going to do that, and not picking favorites, but really to listen, especially when there's legislation up that and there always is, that affects the well-being and the livelihood of the people. I think being polling places, talking with interfaith relationships, and also ecumenical colleagues. I think if there are politicians, and this is an issue for us because we have some Lutherans in the legislature, and we're not all on the same page for sure. So this is a conversation we have to constantly have with one another, even the hard talks.
Other than in talking to people that we, within our own denomination and association, which everybody's mentioned, which is great. It just sort of occurred to me, we do a food distribution, and there's plenty of churches that have food pantries or houses of worship that have food pantries or do relief. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, we see maybe 400 people once a month, and I don't give them voter registration pieces. And that's just really easy to do. Whether you've got a food pantry or anything that you're doing to fight food insecurity. Most houses of worship I know of are actively involved in doing relief, and that's just an easy add-on.
Thank you. And just to echo, I think pretty much what all of you have talked about, especially as the hosting of this organization, Dr. Ratliff today, bringing people from outside your own community into your community. That's something that Texas Impact does all the time. If you ask Texas Impact to come into your church and do any kind of training, that's the number one thing they tell faith communities to do. Whether or not you agree with your elected representative, just get to know them. To build a relationship is so important, and to have them come meet your community and to address the issues that are before us as members of the state of Texas. So I think that all of you kind of touched on that. I just thank you all again for representing not just your tradition, but representing our responsibility as Texans, as Americans. So I just thank you all, the leaders that you are.
Thank you for the platform.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation this week. For the second week in a row, we've heard from high-profile religious leaders talking about civic engagement. My hope is that we're not just listening to their inspiring words and then going back to our days. My hope is that we're all thinking about how we can engage our congregations and communities in doing this work. As I said in the open, Texas Impact has tools at texasimpact.org and houstonfaithvotes.org. So spend some time this week thinking about how you can respond. The Texas Impact team is here for you if you need help in figuring it out. Check out our website or email me at scott@texasimpact.org, and let's engage in this work together. While you're on the website, I hope you'll consider joining Texas Impact to support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. Learn more or sign up for one of our teams at texasimpact.org. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode, so remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.